Once upon a time, in a small town nestled deep in the mountains, there was a boy named Ethan. He was a kind and gentle soul who loved nothing more than spending time with his younger siblings. So when he heard that a family in the town needed a babysitter, he eagerly volunteered. The family's house was located at the end of a long road, surrounded by dense forest. It was a beautiful house with a large yard and a stunning view of the mountains. When Ethan arrived, he was greeted by the parents, who introduced him to their 4-year-old daughter, Millie. Lily was a sweet and lively child, with bright eyes and contagious smile. Ethan was immediately taken with her and promised to make their evening together fun and memorable. They started the night with a game of hide and seek, followed by an animated reading of Lily's favorite bedtime story. As the night wore on, Lily grew tired and Ethan put her to bed. He sat by her side, softly singing a lullaby, until she drifted off to sleep. Ethan tiptoed out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. He headed downstairs, planning to spend the rest of the evening watching movies or playing games. But then, he heard a sound. It was a faint rustling noise coming from outside. Ethan's heart began to race as he realized that someone was outside the house. He went to the window and peered out, but he couldn't see anything in the darkness. The sound continued, growing louder and more persistent. Ethan knew that he had to investigate. He crept to the front door, listening intently for any sounds of movement. But there was nothing. The only sound was the rustling noise, which seemed to be coming from the backyard. Ethan cautiously made his way through the kitchen and towards the back door. As he stepped outside, he was hit by a blast of cold air. The yard was bathed in moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Ethan looked around, trying to locate the source of the noise, and then he saw it. There was a figure moving in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the yard. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, with a hood pulled over his head. Ethan's mind raced as he realized that the man was trying to break into the house. He knew that he had to protect Lily and get her out of the house, but as he turned to head back inside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Lily's bedroom window was open, and there was a hand reaching in. Ethan's heart pounded as he ran towards the window, shouting at the intruder, but the hand disappeared, and there was no sign of the man in the shadows. Ethan raced inside, snatched Lily from her bed, and sprinted towards the front door. But as he reached the door, he saw that it was already open. The man was inside a house, waiting for them. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, and then he remembered the basement. He darted towards the stairs, taking them two at a time. He could hear the man's footsteps getting closer. Ethan burst through the door to the basement and locked it behind him, panting for breath. Lily was crying, but Ethan comforted her, promising to keep her safe. They huddled in the darkness, listening to the sound of the intruder moving around upstairs. Ethan knew that they had to stay quiet and wait for help. It felt like hours before the police arrived. When they finally did, they found the intruder had fled, leaving behind no trace of who he was or why he had targeted the family. Ethan and Lily were shaken but unharmed, and the police assured them that they would do everything they could to find the intruder. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and news reporters, all asking Ethan and the family for details about the break-in. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him since that night. He had always thought of himself as brave and capable, but the experience had left him feeling vulnerable and helpless. As the investigation continued, Ethan began to notice strange things happening around the town. People were acting nervous and fearful, locking their doors and windows at night. Rumors started circulating about a mysterious figure known only as the Shadow Man, who was rumored to be responsible for a string of break-ins and robberies throughout the town. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if the Shadow Man was the same person who had broken into Lily's house. He became obsessed with the idea, spending hours researching and investigating on his own. He talked to neighbors, scoured social media, and even went on late-night stakeouts, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Shadow Man. One night, Ethan was sitting in his car outside of a convenience store, waiting to see if the Shadow Man would show up. He was tired and frustrated, convinced that he was wasting his time. But then he saw something that made his heart race. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving quickly towards the store. Ethan recognized the clothing and the hooded sweatshirt. It was the Shadow Man. Ethan hesitated for a moment, wondering what to do. He knew that he couldn't confront the shadow man on his own, but he also knew that he had to do something. He made a split-second decision and got out of his car, following the shadow man into the store. Inside, the shadow man was holding up the clerk at gunpoint, demanding money from the cash register. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he crept closer, trying to get a better look at the man's face. And then he saw it. The shadow man's hood had fallen back, revealing a familiar face. It was the same man who had broken into Lily's house, the same man who had tried to harm her. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do next. He knew that he couldn't let the shadow man get away. He had to act fast. With a burst of adrenaline, Ethan lunged at the man, tackling him to the ground. The gun went off, but no one was hurt. The police arrived a few minutes later, arresting the shadow man and taking him away. Ethan was hailed as a brave man, and the town breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for Ethan, the experience had changed him in profound ways. He had learned that bravery wasn't just about standing up to danger. It was also about facing your fears and standing up for what you believe in. And most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the scariest moments in life could also be the most transformative. It was a cold, dark winter evening when Sarah arrived at the house of the Smiths for her babysitting job. The house was old, with creaky floorboards and a musty smell that permeated the air. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, Sarah needed the money and was determined to do a good job. Mrs. Smith left Sarah with instructions to put the children to bed by 8 p.m. and not to let them watch any scary movies. The children, a boy named Timmy and a girl named Emily, were excited to have a babysitter and took to Sarah quickly. After a few hours of playing games and reading stories, Sarah tucked the children into bed and settled down to watch TV. It was then that strange things started happening. The lights flickered and the TV went static. Sarah tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just an old house, but the unease she felt grew stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, Sarah heard footsteps coming from upstairs. She thought it was strange since the children were supposed to be asleep. She went upstairs to check on them, but as she reached the landing, she saw that the door to the attic was open. Sarah had an uneasy feeling in her stomach, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that the children might have gone up there. She slowly climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the top, she saw that the attic was empty and the window was open. Sarah tried to close it, but it wouldn't budge. She shrugged it off, telling herself that it was probably just the wind. But as she turned around to leave, she heard a soft whisper in her ear. "Help me," it said. Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. She tried to shake off the feeling that she was being watched and went back downstairs. As she settled back into the couch, Sarah heard a loud thump from upstairs. She ran up to check on the children and found Emily sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and shaking. "What's wrong, Emily?" Sarah asked. "The man in my closet," Emily whispered. Sarah's heart raced as she slowly opened the closet door. Inside, she found a man huddled in a corner, his eyes staring blankly ahead. Sarah recognized him as the former owner of the house, who had died in the attic many years ago. As Sarah tried to lead the children out of the room, she heard the sound of footsteps following them. She turned around and saw the ghostly figure of the former owner standing behind her, his eyes cold and lifeless. Sarah's terror turned to panic as she realized that the house was not just haunted, but that the ghost was out for revenge. She grabbed the children and ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. As the ghostly figure drew closer, Sarah's mind raced. She had to find a way out, but how? Suddenly, she remembered something Mrs. Smith had told her earlier. The key to the front door was hidden behind a painting in the living room. Sarah sprinted to the living room, grabbed the key, and ran back to the front door. She fumbled with the lock, but it finally opened, and they burst out into the cold, dark night. As they stood in the driveway, gasping for breath, Sarah looked back at the house. The ghostly figure was standing in the doorway, staring at them with a look of pure hatred. Sarah knew that she had narrowly escaped with her life, and that she would never forget the terror of that night. From that day on, Sarah never took another babysitting job again. The Smiths eventually moved out of the house, But the memory of that night stayed with Sarah for years to come. She couldn't shake off the feeling that the ghost of the former owner was still out there, waiting for his next victim. Years later, Sarah had moved on from her babysitting days and was successful. However, she never forgot about the haunted house and the terror she had experienced there. One day, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was Mrs. Smith, the woman who had hired her for the babysitting job all those years ago. She told Sarah that the house had been sold to a new family and that strange things had been happening to them as well. Sarah knew that she had to go back to the house and confront the ghost once and for all. She arrived at the house, and as soon as she stepped inside, felt the same sense of unease she had experienced years ago. The new family had reported similar incidents, strange noises, flickering lights, and whispers in the night. Sarah knew that the only way to stop the ghost was to find out what had happened to him all those years ago. She searched the house, and in the attic, found a box of old documents. Among them was a letter from the former owner to his wife, pleading with her not to leave him. Sarah realized that the ghost was still trapped in the house, waiting for his wife to return. She went to the local cemetery and found the grave of the owner's wife. She placed flowers on the grave and said a prayer, hoping that it would finally bring peace to the restless spirit. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Millie who needed some extra cash. She was browsing through job postings when she stumbled upon a babysitting gig that paid handsomely. The family needed someone to look after their young daughter while they attended a party, and Lily saw it as an easy way to make some money. On the night of the babysitting job, Lily arrived at the house to find it eerily quiet. The parents were rushing out the door, and Lily barely had time to introduce herself before they were gone. She shrugged it off, thinking that the little girl was probably already asleep. As she made her way to the living room, Lily suddenly felt a shiver run down her spine. Something felt off. It was almost like she was being watched. She looked around, but the house was still quiet, and there was no sign of anyone else being there. Lily decided to check on the little girl, who was sound asleep in her room. She tucked her in and made her way back to the living room. But as she sat down on the couch, she heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. Her heart racing, Lily slowly made her way up the stairs. The noise was coming from one of the rooms, and as she got closer, she realized it was the parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and Lily could see that the light was on. Trembling with fear, Lily pushed the door open and peered inside. The room was empty, but there was something on the bed that made her blood run cold. It was a doll, with a sinister grin on its face that Lily was sure wasn't there before. Lily tried to shake off the feeling of dread as she made her way back downstairs. She convinced herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then she heard another noise, this time coming from the kitchen. When Lily entered, she stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the chaos around her. The cupboards and drawers had been pulled open, and their contents were scattered across the floor. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was as if a tornado had swept through the room. She called out, but there was no response. Lily's heart was racing, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't want to believe that someone had broken into the house. As she turned around to leave the kitchen, she saw a figure standing in front of her. It was a man with dark, hollow eyes, wearing a mask that looked like it was made of human skin. The sight of him made her scream, and she turned and ran towards the front door. But the door was locked from the outside, and Lily knew she was trapped. She could hear the man's footsteps coming up the stairs, getting closer and closer. Her heart felt like it was about to burst out of her chest, and she knew she had to do something to defend herself. Lily's hands shook as she frantically searched the little girl's room for something to defend herself with. Her eyes fell upon a small pink baseball bat lying in the corner of the room. It was far from an ideal weapon, but it was the only thing she could find. Lily gripped the bat tightly and climbed the stairs, taking each step carefully and quietly, hoping the intruder wouldn't hear her. The sound of his footsteps grew louder and louder, and Lily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the top of the stairs and could hear the man's breathing coming from the end of the hallway. She could see the doorknob to the little girl's room just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. Lily knew that she had to act fast. She fumbled with the key, trying to get it into the lock as quietly as possible. Her hands were shaking so badly that she almost dropped the key, but she managed to get the door unlocked just in time. She rushed inside and locked the door behind her, her heart racing in her chest. She could hear the intruder's footsteps getting closer, and she knew that it was only a matter of seconds before he reached the door. Lily braced herself, her grip tightening on the baseball bat. She could hear the doorknob turning, and then suddenly, the door burst open. The intruder stood there, his eyes wild, his face contorted with rage. Lily swung the bat with all her might, hitting the intruder in the chest. He stumbled back, but he didn't fall. He lunged at her, and Lily swung the bat again, this time hitting him in the head. The intruder fell to the ground, unconscious. Lily stood there, panting, her heart racing, and her hands shaking. She had done it. She had defended herself against the intruder. But she also knew that the danger wasn't over yet. She had to call the police and get help. Lily quickly called the police, who arrived moments later. They arrested the man and took him away. The parents returned to find their home in disarray, but were relieved that both Lily and their daughter were safe. The police arrived shortly after Lily had subdued the intruder. They took him away in handcuffs, and the girl recounted the night's events to them in detail. They assured her that she had done the right thing and commended her for her bravery. The parents arrived home to find their house in shambles, but they were grateful that Lily and their daughter were safe. They praised her for her quick thinking and bravery and offered to pay her more than they had originally agreed upon. Lily spent the next few weeks trying to process what had happened to her. She couldn't shake off the feeling of terror and vulnerability that she had experienced that night. The incident also made her think about the little girl she had been babysitting. Lily couldn't bear the thought of a child growing up in a world where people like the intruder existed. The end. Once there was a girl named Emily who was struggling to make ends meet. She had just graduated from college and was looking for work to pay off her student loans. One day she came across an ad for a babysitter and decided to apply. The family seemed nice and the pay was good, so she accepted the job. The family lived in a big house on the outskirts of town. It was a little creepy, but Emily didn't think much of it. She was just happy to have a job. The first night went well, and Emily thought it was going to be an easy gig. But the second night was different. Emily arrived at the house at around 7 p.m. The parents told her that they would be back late and that she should put the kids to bed around 8 p.m. Emily didn't mind. She loved kids and was looking forward to spending some quality time with them. After dinner, Emily put the kids to bed and went to the living room to watch TV. But something caught her eye. There was a figure standing outside the window. Emily froze. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She just stared at the figure. The figure was a man wearing a black hoodie and black pants. Emily couldn't see his face, but she knew he was staring right at her. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. The figure just stood there staring at her. After what felt like hours, Emily finally managed to break out of her trance. She ran to the front door, locked it, and called the police. But when the police arrived, the figure was nowhere to be found. Emily was shaken but tried to shake it off. She thought it was just a prank or a creepy neighbor. She stayed at the house and waited for the parents to come back. When they finally arrived, Emily told them what had happened, but they didn't seem too concerned. They just said that it was probably just a prank and that she shouldn't worry. The third night was worse. Emily was in the kitchen when she heard a knock on the door. She went to open it, but no one was there. She thought it was strange, but she didn't think too much of it. Later that night, Emily was putting the kids to bed when she heard a noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking around. Emily was scared, but she didn't want to frighten the kids, so she went to investigate. As she climbed the stairs, the noise grew louder. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the figure again. This time, he was standing right in front of her. She could see his face, and it was terrifying. The man had a scar above his eyebrow, and his eyes were dark and soulless. Emily tried to scream, but the man grabbed her and covered her mouth. He whispered in her ear, "Don't scream. I won't hurt you if you do as I say." Emily was paralyzed with fear. She didn't know what to do. The man dragged her to the master bedroom and tied her up. He said that he wouldn't hurt her if she didn't try to escape. The rest of the night was a blur for Emily. She was in and out of consciousness. When she woke up in the morning, The man was gone. The parents had arrived home. Emily told them everything that had happened, and the police were called again. They searched the house and found evidence that the man had been there, but they never caught him. Emily never babysat again after that night. She was traumatized and couldn't bear the thought of being alone with children. The incident haunted her for years, and she never forgot the man's face. In the weeks and months that followed, Emily struggled to come to terms with what had happened to her. She saw a therapist and tried to move on with her life, but the memory of the man's face and his terrifying actions were never far from her thoughts. Despite her fears, Emily decided to go back to school to become a teacher. She wanted to help children and make a difference in their lives. She excelled in her studies and eventually landed a job at a local elementary school. Everything was going well for Emily until one day she saw the man again. He was standing outside the school, watching her. Emily froze in fear, but she knew that she had to do something. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. The police told Emily that they would keep an eye out for the man, but they didn't think that there was anything they could do. Emily was left feeling scared and vulnerable once again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but the man never appeared again. Emily began to think that she was safe and that he had moved on, but she was wrong. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of someone knocking on her front door. She got out of bed and cautiously approached the door. When she opened it, she saw the man standing on her doorstep. He looked even more terrifying than before. His scar was more prominent, and his eyes were filled with an intense darkness. Emily tried to close the door, but the man was too strong. He pushed his way into her apartment and grabbed her. Emily fought back with all her might, but the man was too strong. He tied her up and left her there, just like he had done before. But this time, Emily was determined not to let the man win. She managed to break free from her restraints and ran out of the apartment, screaming for help. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, but once again, the man had disappeared. After that night, Emily moved away and changed her name. She couldn't bear the thought of the man finding her again. She started a new life in a new city and tried to forget everything that had happened to her. Years went by, and Emily started to feel like she had finally moved on. She was happy with her new life and had even started a family of her own. But one day she received a letter in the mail. It was from the man. He had found her. The letter was short and to the point. It said that he was coming for her and that he would never stop until he had her in his grasp once again. Emily was terrified, but she knew that she couldn't let the man win. She called the police and told them everything that had happened. They took the letter and promised to do everything they could to find the man. But Emily knew that she couldn't rely on the police alone. She took matters into her own hands and started to research the man. She dug through old police reports and newspapers and eventually found out his name and where he lived. Emily knew that it was a risk, but she went to the man's house and confronted him. She told him that she was not going to live in fear anymore, and that he would never control her life again. The man was taken aback by Emily's bravery, and he started to cry. He told her that he had been struggling with mental health issues and that he didn't know what he was doing. Emily felt sorry for the man, but she knew that she couldn't let him get away with what he had done. She called the police, and the man was arrested and charged with kidnapping. Years went by, and Emily was finally able to put the incident behind her. She focused on her family and her teaching career, and the memories of the man slowly faded away. However, one day she received a call from the prison. The man had died in his cell. Emily was shocked by the news. She didn't know how to feel. She knew that the man had done terrible things to her, but she also knew that he was struggling with his own demons. Emily decided to visit the man's grave. She wanted to see the man who had caused her so much pain and to make peace with what had happened. When she arrived at the cemetery, she saw that the man's grave was unmarked. Emily felt a pang of sadness. She knew that the man had been troubled, but she also knew that he deserved a proper burial. Emily went to the funeral home and arranged for a headstone to be placed on the man's grave. She chose a simple design with his name and the years of his birth and death. When the headstone was placed, Emily felt a sense of closure. She knew that the man's troubled life had come to an end, and she could finally move on with hers. Years went by, and Emily never forgot what had happened to her. She used her experience to help other victims of violence and abuse, and she became an advocate for mental health awareness. Emily's story was a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurk in the world around us. It was a story of courage, strength, and forgiveness. Emily had been through a lot, but she had come out the other side a stronger and more compassionate person. Her story had a lasting impact on those who heard it, and it served as a reminder that we should never take our safety and security for granted. Emily's experience had taught her to be vigilant and to always be aware of her surroundings, but it had also taught her that forgiveness and compassion can be powerful tools for healing. Jack had always been a quiet and introverted person, which made it difficult for him to make friends. But he loved children and found that babysitting was the perfect way to connect with the younger generation. It was also a way for him to make some extra cash, which he needed to save up for college. One summer evening, Jack received a call from Mrs. Johnson, a woman who lived a few streets down from him. She was looking for a babysitter for her 3-year-old daughter, Emily, while she and her husband went out for a dinner party. Jack accepted the job and arrived at the Johnsons' house promptly at 7 p.m. Mrs. Johnson gave Jack a quick rundown of Emily's bedtime routine and left for the party with her husband. Jack spent the next couple of hours playing with Emily, reading her a story and putting her to bed. After that, Jack decided to watch some TV in the living room. It was around 11 p.m., and Jack was starting to doze off when he heard a knock on the door. He looked through the peephole and saw a man standing outside. Jack hesitated to open the door, but the man spoke through the door, asking for help with his car that had broken down on the street. Jack decided to help and opened the door. The man introduced himself as Mr. White and led Jack to his car. As Jack approached the vehicle, he realized that it was empty. Before he could react, Mr. White hit Jack over the head with a blunt object, knocking him unconscious. When Jack woke up, he found himself tied up in a dark room with no windows. He tried to free himself, but the ropes were too tight. Jack called out for help, but there was no response. After what felt like hours, Jack heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Mr. White walked in with a knife in his hand. Jack screamed, but Mr. White didn't seem to care. He proceeded to torture and mutilate Jack in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Days turned into weeks, and Jack lost all sense of time. He was trapped in the dark room with no food or water and subjected to constant torture and abuse at the hands of Mr. White. Jack's body was covered in bruises and cuts, and he had lost a significant amount of weight. During his time in captivity, Jack thought about his family and friends and how much he missed them. He thought about Emily, the little girl he had been babysitting, and wondered what had happened to her. Jack knew that he had to find a way to escape, or else he would die in that room. One day, when Mr. White was out, Jack managed to break free from his restraints. He stumbled out of the room and into the hallway, where he saw Emily's room. He went inside and found the little girl lying in her bed, unharmed but fast asleep. Jack picked up Emily and carried her out of the house, but as he was about to leave, he heard footsteps approaching. He quickly hid in a closet with Emily and waited for the footsteps to fade away. After a few minutes, he cautiously opened the closet door and saw Mr. White standing in the living room, holding a knife. Jack knew that he had to act fast. He grabbed a lamp from a nearby table and hit Mr. White over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then called the police and reported his location. The police arrived at the Johnsons' house and arrested Mr. White. They found evidence of his previous murders and discovered that he had been on the run for years. Jack was taken to the hospital and treated for his injuries. He was reunited with his family, who had been frantically searching for him. They were overjoyed to see him alive and well, but they knew that he had been through a traumatic experience. Jack spent the next few weeks recovering from his injuries and receiving therapy for the trauma he had experienced. He was grateful to be alive, but he was haunted by the memories of his captivity. The incident left a lasting impact on everyone who knew Jack. The Johnsons were devastated by what had happened, and the incident left the entire neighborhood in shock. The murder of Jack had a lasting impact on Emily, who was too young to understand what had happened, but had been traumatized by the absence of her babysitter. The community came together to support Jack and his family, holding fundraisers and events to raise money for his medical expenses. The incident also sparked a conversation about safety measures for babysitters and the importance of conducting background checks on strangers. As for Mr. White, he was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case was widely covered in the media, and it became known as one of the most disturbing and shocking crimes in the history of the town. Years later, Jack had mostly recovered from his traumatic experience, but he still carried the memories with him. He had developed a newfound appreciation for life and the people around him, knowing that they could be taken away at any moment. The incident had also given him a sense of purpose, and he had decided to pursue a career in psychology, hoping to help others who had experienced trauma and abuse. In the end, the story of Jack's harrowing experience became a cautionary tale, a reminder that danger could lurk in the most unexpected places, and that it was important to be vigilant and cautious when dealing with strangers. It was a story that would never be forgotten by those who had experienced it, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that could exist in the human heart.